If Lord Acton was right that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, then it is little wonder that we tend to view the best leaders as those who don't necessarily want the top job. We appreciate those who view leadership as a burden and only accept positions of power because they feel there is no other choice. It's a useful idea, and certainly helpful to bear in mind as we examine the motivations of those vying for leadership positions. But the example of the Emperor Tiberius shows us that, like any idea, there must be caveats when we praise reluctant rulers. For Tiberius not only fought tooth and nail with Augustus to avoid becoming emperor, but even when he finally accepted his fate and ascended to the throne, he showed very little interest at all in actually ruling. However, despite his aversion to exercising power, Tiberius was still one of the worst Roman emperors. In fact, it was his own willful separation from the demands and responsibilities of his position that opened him up to the influence of self-interested hangers-on who leveraged the power of the principate for their own ends. As the son of Augustus's third wife, Livia, Tiberius bore no blood relation to the first princeps, and as Augustus attempted to lay the foundations of a dynasty, Tiberius was never his first choice for an heir. But the fates seemingly conspired to ensure that Tiberius would inherit the new position of power that Augustus had carved out of the skeletal remains of the Republic. The precariousness of life in the ancient world, even for those in the imperial family, is on true display as we read through the list of individuals, many much younger than Tiberius, that died before Augustus, ultimately leaving him no other option but his sulking stepson. Though Tiberius had been a successful general, he was so averse to becoming princeps that during the reign of Augustus he exiled himself to the island of Rhodes so that he could no longer be considered for the position. Ultimately, the untimely deaths of his grandsons Lucius and Gaius Caesar left Augustus with no choice but to recall Tiberius from Rhodes and to formally adopt him in a show to all that Tiberius would be the next princeps. Taking power in the year 14 upon the death of Augustus, Tiberius still appears reluctant in our sources to take on the full responsibilities of his new office. Tiberius happened to say that although he was not equal to the whole burden of the state, yet he would undertake the charge of whatever part of it might be entrusted to him. Thereupon Asinius Gallus said, "I ask you, Caesar, what part of the state you wish to have entrusted to you?" Confounded by the sudden inquiry, he was silent for a few moments. Then, recovering his presence of mind, he replied that it would by no means become his modesty to choose or to avoid in a case where he would prefer to be wholly excused. Then Gallus again, who had inferred anger from his looks, and that the question had not been asked with the intention of dividing what could not be separated, but to convince him by his own admission that the body of the state was one and must be directed by a single mind, he further spoke in praise of Augustus, and reminded Tiberius himself of his victories and of his admirable deeds for many years as a civilian. Whether this reluctance was genuine, or was simply Tiberius acting the part of a humble sovereign, we cannot say. We cannot know his mind, so are left only to interpret his actions, and Tiberius showed much less enthusiasm for governing than his predecessor. But like nature, power abhors a vacuum, and so into the void stepped Lucius Aelius Sejanus, an equestrian appointed as co-Praetorian Prefect under Augustus, but a wily political operator who had the incredibly important job all to himself in 15, just 1 year into Tiberius's reign. Augustus had founded the Praetorian Guard to keep him from meeting the same fate as his adoptive father, Julius Caesar. But given that he was concerned with adorning his regime with the trappings of a restored republic, He was always insistent on keeping this new armed force, which answered directly to him alone, from appearing like the right hand of a monarch that it really was, keeping the Praetorians scattered throughout Italy, where they would have been out of sight and out of mind for senators and other elites that may still have been sensitive to significant breaches of republican norms. Sejanus would forever change this in 20 by moving the Praetorians into a fortress constructed just outside Rome. Now, and for the next 3 centuries in fact, the shadow of the Guard would loom large over imperial politics, and it became vital for any regime, or any prospective claimant, to secure the loyalty of this military unit that protected the ruling family, but also represented the greatest threat. Though the future implications of Sejanus's decision may not have been apparent at the time, the increasingly paranoid Tiberius appears to have been glad to have the Praetorians close at hand, but he seems unaware that as he outsourced ever more duties to his staff, that the ambitious prefect was slowly accumulating power by trading favors with the Roman elite and placing ever more senators and equestrians in his personal debt through the dynamics of the patronage and clientship that was critical to Roman social organization. Sejanus's growing influence was also eased by his ability to cultivate the mistrust and paranoia that Tiberius seemed to have no trouble manifesting on his own. Soon, Tiberius found himself at odds with Germanicus, and after his suspicious death in 19, Tiberius and Sejanus always remained mindful of the general's widow, Agrippina, mother of the future emperor, Caligula. But he also turned on others in the imperial family, fearing that they were conspiring against him. No doubt, these suspicions were fueled by the intelligence gathered by Sejanus's loyal network of spies and informers. Sejanus would even seduce the wife of Tiberius's son, Drusus, to cause further rifts in the imperial family. There were, however, obstacles to his ambitions in the imperial house, with its many princes, a son in youthful manhood, and grown-up grandsons. As it would be unsafe to sweep off such a number at once by violence, while craft would necessitate successive intervals in crime, he chose, on the whole, the stealthier way, and, to begin with Drusus, against whom he had the stimulus of a recent resentment. Drusus, who could not brook a rival, and was somewhat irascible, had, in a casual dispute, raised his fist at Sejanus, and, when he defended himself, had struck him in the face. On considering every plan, Sejanus thought his easiest revenge was to turn his attention to Livia, Drusus's wife. She was a sister of Germanicus, and though she was not handsome as a girl, she became a woman of surpassing beauty. Pretending an ardent passion for her, he seduced her, and, having won his first infamous triumph, and assured that a woman, after having parted with her virtue, will hesitate at nothing, he lured her on to thoughts of marriage, of a share in sovereignty, and of her husband's destruction. And she, the niece of Augustus, the daughter-in-law of Tiberius, the mother of children by Drusus, for a provincial paramour, foully disgraced herself, her ancestors, and her descendants, giving up honor and a sure position for prospects as base as they were uncertain. Soon after Sejanus had won Claudia Livia to his side, Drusus was dead under murky circumstances, and later historians would report that he was poisoned. This only increased Tiberius's paranoia and isolation, and 3 years later, in 26, the emperor left Rome for the secluded island paradise of Capri, leaving Sejanus to govern in his stead. In this second self-imposed exile, Tiberius would devote himself purely to pleasure and debauchery, far from the prying eyes of the capital. Despite the seclusion, he was still watched, however, by the Praetorian Guard, as the soldiers loyal to Sejanus effectively controlled who had access to the emperor. Tiberius had never shown interest in governing, but now Sejanus was able to ensure that any news from Rome was filtered to his liking, removing any potential check on his power in the city. If you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing. We're a small channel, and this is the only way to get the almighty YouTube algorithm to notice us. Furthermore, you can help Tribunate become more sustainable by becoming a member for as little as 99 cents a month. Thank you for all of your support. In his new position as the only access point for the emperor, Sejanus benefited tremendously, accumulating massive wealth through bribes and gifts from the senatorial elite, who knew the importance of remaining on his good side. But it appears that the man who had once been a deft political operator allowed this power and prestige to go to his head. His greatest asset had always been that his humbled equestrian background made members of the imperial family feel that he could be trusted, because someone without a storied lineage would obviously never seek to attain power themselves, but would be content to serve. In the years after Tiberius's exile, though, his rule became overbearing, and senators resented having to treat a man they viewed as their inferior with so much deference. They were used to having clients come calling at their doors in the morning begging for favors, and detested having to debase themselves in a similar manner for this upstart equestrian. Sejanus was so great a person by reason both of his excessive haughtiness and of his vast power, that, to put it briefly, he himself seemed to be the emperor, and Tiberius a kind of island potentate, inasmuch as the latter spent his time on the island of Capri. There was rivalry and jostling about the great man's doors, the people fearing not merely that they might not be seen by their patron, but also that they might be among the last to appear before him, for every word and look, especially in the case of the most prominent men, was carefully observed. This success led Sejanus to overestimate how indispensable he was to Tiberius, culminating in his request to marry Claudia Livia, the widow of Tiberius's son Drusus, though he would later assent to the partnership, for now this was a non-starter for Tiberius, and he reminded Sejanus of his deficient lineage in no uncertain terms. You are mistaken, Sejanus, if you think that you will then remain in the same position, and that Livia, who has been the wife of Caius Caesar, and afterwards Drusus, will have the inclination to pass her old age with a mere Roman knight. Though I might allow it, do you imagine it would be tolerated by those who have seen her brother, her father, and our ancestors in the highest offices of state? But though for the time being Sejanus was blocked from his ultimate dream of imperial adoption and potentially becoming Tiberius's heir, he was still the most powerful man in Rome, a position ironically guaranteed by his lower equestrian status. The death of Tiberius's mother Livia, the widow of Augustus, in 29 removed one of the final checks on his absolute power, and more crucially, one of the last people standing between him and members of the imperial house and their allies. Soon after Livia's death, Sejanus used his network of informers to bring senators to trial on trumped-up charges. These actions purged the Senate of those that opposed him, refused to participate in his bribery schemes, or were too close to Agrippina and her faction. Soon, even the popular Agrippina and two of her sons, Nero and Drusus, were arrested and died in his custody. Only one son would survive, Gaius. Today we know him as Caligula. Soon, however, Sejanus was using his loyal network of spies and informants to wage a smear campaign against the youngest and sole surviving son of the great general Germanicus. But in 31, 2 years into the peak of Sejanus's reign of terror, and with his fortunes seemingly set, now that he had been granted permission to marry Claudia Livia, everything changed in an instant. We will never know exactly what caused Tiberius to turn on his former right-hand man, but the signs point to a letter exposing Sejanus authored by Antonia Minor, making it through the Praetorian blockade. Coupled with political moves back in Rome, where Sejanus appears to have hinted at the revival of republican elections, Tiberius decided that Sejanus had outlived his usefulness. So he enacted a brilliant plan which brought the prefect to a swift and merciless end. Tiberius, however, who was no longer ignorant of anything that concerned his minister, was planning how he might put him to death. But, not finding any way of doing this openly and safely, he handled both Sejanus himself and the Romans in general in a remarkable fashion, so as to learn exactly what was in their minds. He kept sending dispatches of all kinds regarding himself both to Sejanus and to the Senate, now saying that he was in a bad state of health and almost at the point of death, and now that he was exceedingly well and would arrive in Rome directly. At one moment he would heartily praise Sejanus, and again would as heartily denounce him, and, while honoring some of Sejanus's friends out of regard for him, he would be disgracing others. Thus Sejanus, filled in turn with extreme elation and extreme fear, was in constant suspense, for it never occurred to him, on the one hand, to be afraid and so attempt a revolution, inasmuch as he was still held in honor, nor, on the other hand, to be bold and attempt some desperate venture, inasmuch as he was frequently abased. So, also, with the people at large. They kept hearing alternately the most contradictory reports, which came at brief intervals, and so were unable either to regard Sejanus any longer with admiration, or, on the other hand, to hold him in contempt, while, as for Tiberius, they were kept guessing whether he was going to die or return to Rome. Consequently, they were in a continual state of doubt. Ultimately, Sejanus would be humiliated by Tiberius, with the emperor summoning him before the Senate, and the prefect being told that a letter announcing enormous honors was to be read before the body. Only once the seal was cracked did Sejanus learn the horrible truth. The letter, which he believed could designate him as imperial heir, in fact denounced him before the Senate. Tiberius had kept everyone on edge until the last moment, and had mobilized the Vigiles, Rome's police force, led by Caligula's friend Macro, to destroy Sejanus. The day that the prefect thought represented the pinnacle of his career would in fact mark his unceremonious end. This skilled maneuvering is evidence that Tiberius still possessed a keen ability to navigate the political scene in Rome, despite his absence, and, in my opinion, casts doubt on the narrative that he was totally under Sejanus's control and influence while in his island retreat on Capri. Perhaps Tiberius was in fact well aware of all that Sejanus was doing in his name, and was content to let the prefect play the part of the public villain, to keep his own hands clean while Sejanus was condemned for killing so many senators and even members of the imperial house. If the purpose of a system is what it does, then the purpose of a murderous prefect, given a long leash, is to do just what he has shown a willingness to do. Though Tiberius feigned shock and outrage at Sejanus's misdeeds, I do not believe that he was surprised. For I find it unlikely that Tiberius's hand would have been forced by Sejanus moving forward with a conspiracy that endangered Tiberius himself. Sejanus had enormous power and influence, and in a world defined by patronage and family alliances, surely knew that all he enjoyed was a result of imperial favor that could disappear in an instant if Tiberius were to die, especially if it were at Sejanus's hands. Furthermore, Tiberius certainly did not object to Sejanus's methods. As soon he embarked on his own reign of terror, and violent purges using the same tactics of informers and treason trials to remove anyone he perceived as having been close to Sejanus. This obviously included many members of Rome's elite, as refusing to stay in Sejanus's good graces in years past itself merited a death sentence. The entire morbid tale reveals to us the corrupting nature of power that Lord Acton described, and that in many contexts, those who seek out power to further their own personal ends, and not the betterment of all, are always the authors of tragedy. In the words of Juvenal, "Do you wish to be greeted like Sejanus? To be as rich? To dispense the seats of highest office to some, and to appoint others to army commands? To be seen as the emperor's guardian, as he sits on the narrow rock of Capri with his herd of astrologers? I'm sure you'd like his javelins and cohorts and excellent cavalry and personal barracks. Why wouldn't you? Even people with no desire to kill like the power to do so." After his death, Sejanus's memory was condemned, his statues destroyed, and all inscriptions, even coins, bearing his name were defaced. It seemed that the man would have no legacy, and certainly would not be the subject of a YouTube video 2,000 years later. But Sejanus would ultimately prove to be among the most influential figures in the early imperial era for his elevation of the Praetorian Guard, and the new potential of these soldiers to shape imperial politics. Tiberius felt that ridding himself of Sejanus alone would free Rome from this malign influence. But by leaving the guard intact, the nature of this problem would not change. Caligula, Tiberius's successor, would pay for this mistake as he was assassinated by the Praetorians sworn to protect him, setting a disruptive precedent that led to instability and the deaths of many emperors. So perhaps Lord Acton was too reserved. It isn't just absolute power that corrupts, but the very act of seeking it.